Sure, there's going to be a question. Oh, yep, Neer's right there at the mic. While he's preparing, I want to plant one question that we can address, and that is the changing role of viewing the lens of what we do through the consumer or the patient to the system through which we have to navigate and ultimately get there. I started in drug development 54 years ago, and at that time it was very clear. We talked about the patient very early in our process, and somewhere in the late 80s and early 90s we started talking about the managed care systems and the structures we had to get through and the barriers and the patient. Oh yeah, by the way, we got to think about the patient. It came very late. And the ownership of the disease rests predominantly on the patient, no matter how much the other advisors. So I want us to think about how we're beginning to shift back to maybe where it was when many of us started these journeys. And quite frankly, I found much more exciting than, with all due respect to the payers trying to satisfy the payers' cost containment model. That's an important loop, but it's really not the relevance of trying to improve people's lives. So think about how we can comment on what needs to be done to enhance that. Neer.
Two questions. First of all, I'm a diabetologist, and I want everybody to know that those incretins have changed how we treat diabetes. It's just absolutely amazing.
It is.
The question for you is, have you considered to use the ITP, that's the intervention testing program of the NIA, to show if actually the GLP-1 affects aging? It's a very simple thing to do, because when you come, I know you think it's obesity mainly, but I think if there's a drug that targets several diseases that you pick up on, it is possible that it is in the midst of aging. The second question for Pepsi, I was the advisor for Pepsi on aging, and so I have three questions after I went and you came. The problem with aging is between 65 and 85, you go from overnutrition to undernutrition. So, you know, it's not who's the old, but at which stage of aging you are, and everybody is in different age. So what do you do with that? What do you do with the fact that some of your snacks, high-protein snacks, will activate mTOR, which we don't want to do when you're age? And third, what do you do about the labels that we cannot read on those snacks for the elderly?
Okay, we'll start with GLP-1. Stephen, I'll let you answer, and then I'll add a comment here at the end.
So to say, specifically, are we pursuing or have we thought about pursuing aging? In terms of aging, no. But clearly what we are doing is pursuing diseases or conditions that we think are highly associated with the aging process. As I explained and showed from the slides that I showed you, I think probably the closest we're getting to it is with mild cognitive impairment, and I think we're currently looking into this in a much bigger way, because we see this as a major issue for society, and clearly as a major issue as part of the aging process. But I must admit my eyes and ears have been opened over the last 24 hours, and I've also made a large number of notes from all the presentations, because I think there are a number of messages that I will certainly be taking back to Copenhagen. So I can't make any promises, but this has certainly opened my eyes.
I can tell you, when we first were doing research at Amylin on GLP-1, and Dan Drucker had characterized it, and John Ong had presented this Gila monster spit, there was an earlier idea, well, gee, maybe this will prolong quality of life. And we had a very frank discussion. Well, who's going to pay for that? It's not cost offset. And if you look at it from an actuarial standpoint, prolonging life increases the liability of payers who have defined benefit retirement plans. And from the federal government standpoint, I remember having an interview with a senator once, and I won't quote his name here, and we were talking about extending lifespan, and he said, son, you got to remember, the lowest cost for the government is when they die. Now, I don't want to cast a pale on things, but the reality is we have to find a way to address aging in a context other than cost displacement. We have to view this as a part of our obligation in the innovative space to create a quality of life that we all aspire to. And if we get there through solving a disease for which we get reimbursement and enhance aging, that's the win-win. Practically, it's the only way to get there. So somebody, you want to take the
So I'm going to give you a
three-part-
very short answer, Nir. I think the previous effort which you were part of crashed on the realization that there are no clear-cut nutritional guidelines for the elderly. And that looked at the time as almost the thing that needed to be fixed first before the company would engage in further thinking. So that was then. I think what I've tried to signal here is that the discussion has been restarted on a completely different ground, and that is, this is a cohort that we cannot ignore whether or not there are guidelines. I've tried to show you the dimension through which we will look again at the problem. And I promise that when I have more precise answers to those three questions that you asked, I will call you personally.
Nir, I should say one thing. I think the idea of a longevity dividend is a key important position for us to start talking about. That it is not, we're not trying to create an artificial process here, but we're actually seeing this as an opportunity for people to live productive lives. So we have to ask ourselves a question: what is this retirement age thing? And what is forced displacement doing to us? And are we really able to say you're no longer able to contribute when you're 62? I mean, come on, look at many of us in this room. Hopefully, some of us are still making a small contribution. We're not only just sucking air, but maybe producing something of value. And you'd hope that that value process can get translated into how science gets applied. Next question. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll alternate back and forth. Okay. Sponsor's prerogative.
Thank you. So looking at the people in the room and the people who are not in the room, we have two pharma companies, Sanofi and Novo. I don't know if there are others in the room, I don't know. But what do you think is required in order to get the attention of the rest of the industry in a field like this? And I know in the past year or two, I've heard comments like, wake me up when there's a clear regulatory pathway, or we understand what product you're selling into which sales force we're going to slip the product. So there are business issues and regulatory issues, but it's going to be an important conversation going forward, and I'd be interested in your thoughts to speak on behalf of colleagues who are not in the room.
So, I would just reiterate that I think for us, and my advice, because I know it's a very bumpy road, not a clear road ahead with the regulatory pathway, is that I think what we need to do is look at how, from my point of view, how we can better look at that pathway to help us address the diseases where we have where we have very clearly defined endpoints. Because I think that through that we can impact on quality of life and how we lead our lives. But I think, as a company, we've moved into a number of new therapy areas in the last few years. Obesity is a relatively new area for us, and that's not an easy process. And there was a discussion earlier about market access and understanding obesity as a chronic disease, not a lifestyle choice. So we're faced with difficulties there. I think I have no doubt we're faced with difficulties with respect to NASH. And how do we diagnose NASH without a liver biopsy? And do we really want to be doing liver biopsies on however many people? So there's so much work we have to do, I think, at the moment, even in what I would call serious chronic disease, to try and better understand the regulatory path. To me, and I have a biased view, but I've learned a lot in the last 24 hours, that would be my way forward. And try and convince people that by impacting on serious chronic disease, we can impact on quality of life and the life that we lead as we get older.
Thank you. I certainly agree. Here I think we share some similarities. If I may add just a few things, I think what we need to increase in terms of understanding of the disease and targeting more reality from the pharma standpoint is the involvement of multiple stakeholders. So rather than following the good old-fashioned traditional model that we work in isolation as pharmaceutical players in the field, we need to make some effort to build some, for instance, company standards that we all stand behind. I'm talking about real-world evidence generation and the interpretation, because that's going to be a crucial next point, I think, for the better understanding of the data that will be released, and that's unavoidable, whether or not we like it. Some of us do believe in it, some of us have more skepticism in it. But the quality of this data, the quality of connectivity, as you heard from multiple presenters in this forum, will increase. And I think we have to be part of it. We need to open our doors to the patients also. The regulatory bodies need to be involved, the payers, in order to speak more or less the same language rather than continue working in all fields in isolation, in a more holistic. I know it sounds very idealistic, but I truly believe that further steps are still to be made towards this direction.
I think the competitive forces will cause a great deal of galvanizing toward common purpose. If you think about major advances like SSRIs, there was one and then there were 5. H2 antagonists. Today, if you tried to promote a diabetes medicine solely on HbA1c, you would be left in the dust, even on a CV claim today, right? So, I mean, at some point in time, the competitive forces pushes us even further along, and I think introducing the concept that we contribute to improved healthy lifespan will eventually have a resonance with consumers, and that'll influence doctors' prescribing habits, and most importantly, it'll influence payers' inclusion of those medicines or those therapies in a covered plan. That's sort of how the force will work.
Can I just add a point, because so we're having this discussion which is very relevant and very important on the drug side of things. But you can have the exact same discussion on the side of foods. And throughout the 2 days, we have heard all this recommendation about diets that are very good for your health. The problem is that nobody drives the point all the way to how accessible and how affordable those diets are. And even as you only talk of food, you already run into that issue of what is the cost model for those diets to reach the majority of people that need them. So there is always this missing, I mean, we just have to be careful that this discussion about healthy diets doesn't become the privilege of an intellectual group of people that can afford them. So we have to reintroduce back the concept of affordability and accessibility.
Yeah, and I'm just going to also go along with that. I think you have an upstream, challenge of how do you get new products to market. What we see just in a commercially insured group of individuals, take the SGLTs, take the GLP-1s, less than 10% of people who are eligible are on those therapies, right? And so there's a huge gap in implementation of, to your point earlier, Joe, these are, no-brainers in terms of therapies for people with type 2 diabetes, people with metabolic derangements. And so how do we also not only fix the pipeline issue of drug development, but in my view, there's a huge opportunity just to reach people who have great insurance, who have great benefits, who for whatever reason, and we can list the multitude, aren't getting on the right therapies who are eligible.
I think, Antonio, you made a key point, and that is the whole ability of our global system to provide quality food, clean water, maybe safe environments, although that's somewhat distant from where we are, but nonetheless, they're all integrated because they all produce healthy environments. If you don't have a safe environment, you can't exercise, you can't walk around. I mean, there's ample evidence to suggest that we need to start thinking about that in a larger context rather than just the single solution. As much as we would all like to eat out of our own gardens, we can't feed the world out of individual garden plots. And the application of modern science to help us guide choices in what we do, is really important that we stand up and defend the role of evidence-based decisions. And sometimes we have seen anti-science take a movement that has been contrary to a good, healthy world. And remarkably, a lot of folks remain silent on the sidelines to that. We practically need to deal with some of these issues at a broader context. Maybe that's a subject for another panel. You've been waiting patiently. Your turn.
Thank you very much. I would like certainly thank Dr. Zhang Fleming to give me the opportunity. My name is Jinhui Dou. I worked for FD CDER as the botanical drug reviewer, and then became the team lead. And I left the agency. There's some frustration I shared with Antonio, is that the drugs is getting too long to get approved. And I would like to certainly thank the panel to give a very balanced view. I'd like to tell the audience that, you know, the Chinese and American trade started with ginseng and tea. So, now still American ginseng is probably the most wanted plant Chinese and other Asian seniors want. So my comment is there is many dietary supplements, and I think folks here are familiar with this. However, the labeling for the dietary supplements are not much. You basically what's in there, and there are not much directions to the consumers. And also, I like to emphasize that FDA's botanical guidance basically gave the pathway for study mixtures, you know, just like ginseng mixtures as new drugs. So I like people to, you know, especially, you know, the leadership team from different pharmaceutical companies to think to utilize multiple components from one plant. Sometimes, you know, the synergies are there and are forced to find. And probably investment is the key. And I'm traveling to China often, and there is the little investment in developing botanical drugs. However, you know, I'm here. I like to encourage people thinking along that road. Certainly, you can make that in the Pepsi. I remember Pepsi had put ginseng in there probably 15 years ago during the advertisement was showed at the Super Bowl break. And thank you.
Okay, so the question is, well, how do we address nutraceuticals or botanicals? And my experience has been in dealing with large pharma. So I spent 28 years with Lilly and then the next 10 years in biotech. Most large pharmaceutical companies don't have a way of thinking about natural products very easily.
So let me say just one thing. When you start getting into the space of functional foods, the lines are really blurry.
Yes.
And well, it's no secret that you know, when a substance is approved first as a drug and then it makes into the food system, that's very complicated, very challenging, and everybody, you know, can think of their own examples for that. But really, you know, there are many examples of, you know, functional ingredients turning into drugs and drugs turning into functional ingredients. So I think, you know, what I represent, which is somebody who has transitioned across different careers, I would encourage people to think about doing that more and more, because the benefit that is created by cross-thinking is just enormous.
So, next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to first thank you, because there's so much thoughtfulness on this panel about age inequality and the ability for everybody in global health and to learn from each other. So the only thing I wanted to do was I really want to knock down a silo. Last week was the United Nations Older Persons Day, and there was a specialized meeting. Singapore is one of the leaders in successful aging today. The mission in Argentina has focused on aging. There's 270 NGOs around the world and 170 nonprofits that deal specifically with social issues of aging. And when I go to these conferences, and I'm a journalist, but I'm also a financial gerontologist, there is never a major corporation. There is never a major pharmaceutical company. There is never a researcher. But when I go to these conferences, there is never anyone in the field of social change that is here, that has any particular power. And I would love to, there are easy ways to break down these silos. You're both waiting for each other. I'm going to tell you that right now. And I'll end by saying, from the private sector, in 2015, there was the Washington Conference for Aging under Obama. 2 companies came, Uber and Airbnb, and baby, look at them now. So there's a lot to be gained from the private sector working with the social change and social agents all over the world, and it's an easy way to do it. I can tell anybody how to do it if they're interested. But we need you, and you need them. It's very simple. Thank you.
Anybody want to comment on that? Zsolt?
I don't know which one is on. Thank you for your comment. This is exactly the example that I was trying to refer to when I said more openness is required, and somehow I also feel that we are behind that trend. As pharmaceuticals, but there is actually some improvement. So when we talk about our research focuses that it moves more towards behavioral factors, social factors, socioeconomic factors. We support. I think both of us. Maybe I can speak on behalf of you as well. We behavioral an enormous amount of money into hypoglycemia research from the family's perspective, socioeconomic perspective, behavior science. On investigator-initiated activities that actually take a look at this relevant medical or societal points from a very different perspective. So that's a learning process, and we will get there. I'm sure we'll get there. It's just a slower process. But I'm very grateful for your comment, because this is exactly the attention that we need to pay sooner or later, better sooner than later.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would support that, and the only thing I would say is, as I said before, I've learned a lot in the last day and a half, and I'm going to take some ideas back with me. But one of the reasons, I'm not saying Novo Nordisk is different to other companies, but one of the reasons I joined Novo Nordisk was something that's called the triple bottom line. And you have to have your financial responsibility, you have to have your environmental responsibility, and we have our Circular for Zero policy by 2030. And there's also a societal responsibility or social responsibility. And one of the things we set up in 2002 was the World Diabetes Foundation, and I'm really pleased that in the last month I've been adopted onto the board of that, so that we can go around the world and I can be part of this process and look at, it's not about getting our expensive diabetes treatments to patients, it's about providing a service. How do we support the most needed, the most needful? But certainly what I've learnt in the last day and a half might make me think a little bit more about how we might even extend that further.
I have to tell a personal story here because it's right on this point. I've already declared I'm older than dirt, so you know that. But when I first joined Eli Lilly and Company, Mr. Eli was still alive. And one of the things, we couldn't drink coffee at our desk. We had to go up to the cafeteria, and he would join us in the cafeteria. And he would frequently walk around and sit down with, obviously, new green beans, and we were pretty obviously new. And he would say, you know, how do you like the company, and, you know, what do you think? And, you know, my name's on the door. Yes, sir, we know that. And he said, we make money off of people being sick. And he stopped, and I thought, oh, my gosh, where is this going? You know, he said, that's not enough, is it? Well, don't forget it, because part of what we do with that profit is reinvest to solve tomorrow's problems for those patients who are still waiting. And that was the galvanization for me about what the essence of that pharmaceutical industry should be about. I think in the 90s, we kind of lost our way and became more interested in EPS and a lot of other things, and we got locked into a financial algorithm that took us away from focusing on the whole patient. Today's discussion and yesterday just reminded me again about the reason we are here, the calling we have is to do something. You all went to medical school not to develop drugs, but to treat patients, right? So many in this room have that same attitude. I think that's the renaissance in thinking that I find hopeful and stimulatory. Zan, you have... All right.
Well, actually, if you have a question, it's better you ask it, please. Okay, well, thank you very much. Alex Javankov, I'm the CEO of Insilico Medicines, an AI company. I was on the panel before. My question is to Stephen, so congratulations, by the way, on great progress. I think GLP-1 agonists have a huge future, and you have probably the best one. So hope to see it in more indications. I'm just wondering what kind of data you're collecting in the most recent clinical trials, especially where you have liver biopsies. Do you do gene expression profiling? Do you do proteomics? Do you do microbiome from those patients? And do you publish this data?
So in terms of publishing data, I mean, I think one of the things we try to do is publish everything as soon as possible. And if you look at the most recent oral semaglutide program, the Pioneer program, all of those papers were published well ahead of approval. So we're very keen to get things out into the public domain. Sorry, the first part of your question, the data we collect, I think it's fair to say that we've really opened our eyes in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of drug development. And whereas we still want to be pretty agile, pretty flexible, pretty fast, we've got to get there quickly, we're having to broaden our horizons. We're collecting a lot more data. So with respect to our liver program, for example, we're collecting many of the things, if not all of the things you've just mentioned, because we need to, there's no doubt, we need to understand disease. If we're going to develop therapies, we need to better understand it. We have announced a number of major investments in terms of investing in big data around the world, in the clinical trials that we do, collecting just about everything that moves. And I hope that, this will give us some great insights into disease that will then help us develop even better therapies.
Yeah, I just quickly checked the data available for gene expression from Novo. On those studies, there is nothing in GEOs. Okay. So it would be great to get it deposited. Yeah. Thank you.
A couple of small points. Joe, you mentioned safe areas, and you excluded us in the United States. So I think if we're going to think about longevity, we need to think about guns and suicide. And then another point, people, including Bill Gates, think that meat is causing climate change. So I think it's hard to discuss medicine without discussing climate change. So that brings up, and now I'm really thinking about Pepsi, Impossible Burger, and is Pepsi doing anything in the area of replacing beef? I know you're into different things than beef, but it's a general question that affects all of us.
So again, short answer, if you think about especially on the food side of the house, most of our products are brought to the market based on approximately 40 or so high-quality crops. So in that sense, we are already in the space that everybody now wants to go. Now, do we have an interest in plant proteins? Of course.
Next question.
Hi, Art Santora. I just wanted to follow up on at least one observation I've had, and that's that if you want to invite some more people to the meeting next time, you really have to invite an interested congressman or woman. Because what's keeping Neer from getting his study funded by somebody is data exclusivity. Okay, what big pharma or small pharma would be willing to pay for that study if some generic company can just substitute metformin that's out in the marketplace for the information that his company has developed? And I'm not saying this is going to be an easy process, but if there were some way that you could provide, say, a company that sponsored Neer's project, and given it's successful, with data exclusivity, the ability to market their product for basically on what's been demonstrated that hasn't been demonstrated before, for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. I'm not going to specify a length. But pharma has to be able to recover its investment before anybody, I should say in their right mind, is going to invest a company's capital in a new drug development. I think if it were different, Nir would have people beating down his door to be able to sponsor his study with metformin. But that's just not the way things are these days.
Art, thank you very much for raising the issue. I don't know how many of the people in this room know, but Connexum and a group of folks, AFAR and GSA and the Academy for Health and Lifespan Research, are engaging in an effort to seek legislation that's modeled after the Orphan Drug Act and the 21st Century Cures Act, in which we're seeking promotion or facilitation of developments in healthy longevity. We are in contact with the Senator Lamar Alexander's office. We had invited them to the conference. We are in dialogue with them. So please keep your eyes or your ears peeled or whatever, because in addition to our media partner, Aging Analytics Agency, releasing the report on metabesity and longevity, we see this as part of a general public process for seeking incentives to help us to achieve the healthy longevity.
Great. We have 3 minutes, 2 questions. Like Jay Schuyler, we're going to finish on time. So you first.
All right, great. Thank you. I think this is a really good panel so far. My question is probably most directed at Stephen, Zsolt, and maybe you, Joe, as well. So, Stephen, the takeaway I took from what you had mentioned is that as a large pharmaceutical company, you're going to not focus on aging per se, but on a lot of these chronic diseases that contribute to aging. Now, it makes sense, obviously, for Novo and for Sanofi and probably Eli, who are playing in that space already. But what is it going to take for the rest of pharma that is completely concerned with oncology and rare diseases to get excited about this space? Because only 1 or 2 companies can only take it so far, and it seems like we need so much more, and we need a lot of big pharma to also be interested to drive innovation in this space. So I just wanted to get your perspectives on that.
I think we have to accept that what we're talking about is a big area, it's not an inexpensive area to go into. And I think we've already touched on the fact that if you're going to invest in these areas, and we all have shareholders, you have to see some return. And I think you need to be a relatively big company to take this on. And as I've mentioned, if you look at some of the other areas we've moved into, such as obesity and NASH, there are real challenges there. I think we need to really look at how we do trials, and we need to work really closely, and we really need to help the regulators on how we might try and smoothen or change the regulatory process. Because I think at the moment, the way that it is, and I don't see an alternative at the moment, although I see ways we could move forward, it requires a lot of clout. It requires big trials, major investment. And I think if we're going to try and attract more people into it, because in terms of diabetes, I think we're losing companies. We're not attracting, we're losing them. And why is that? And I think it's because drug development is extremely expensive. There's a great expectation. In fact, there's now a need. For every drug that you develop, you basically need a CVOT, and they're not inexpensive. So I think we have to look at how can we be a bit smarter in terms of how we develop drugs, in terms of the sorts of trials we do. Which I'm sure my colleague will also talk to, because I think the future for me, certainly when you've got multiple endpoints, has got to be smart, scientifically robust, real-world evidence.
So I actually now am involved with a small company, and I think I'm more optimistic about facile, small companies able to work as virtual innovation engines. With all due respect, and with a lot of history in my mind, they represent a very large existing set of silos that are only now being integrated at a very top level. But for some of us who are running smaller companies, we can turn pretty quickly. And the encouraging thing about the work Nir's doing and others is I think there is an opportunity for innovation. And certainly We've already heard about the mTOR inhibitor. I think we're going to see a lot more of that type of innovation. We'll find partners willing to take that on in large pharma once we've demonstrated proof of concept, the optimum time for transferring innovation from a high cost of capital, risky-oriented, venture-based company to a low cost of capital, wanting certainty, is in phase 2. So what we really need to do is figure out a way to get through that proof of concept as quickly as possible. And that's the phase that I think is going to produce the greatest amount of yield over the next 5 years. Next question. Oh, sorry.
Can I
Zsolt,
just add, just one sentence, because we are fully aligned here. I think I just want to add that this is one of the advantages of being in a big pharma with multiple, more diverse therapeutic areas. You talked about oncology, for instance. This is exactly Sanofi's approach for the future and future drug developments, to link those therapeutic areas, to find commonalities, to build big data platforms that are not limiting itself for one therapeutic area, for one established disease, but going beyond those traditional borders. So that has been established at Sanofi. We are at the beginning of that learning because we not just need to convince ourselves for the relevance of this, but we also need to involve those stakeholders that I was talking about in order to make this process forward. And then we can hopefully answer your question in the next couple of years.
One more question.
So I'm just going to quickly mention back in 2011.
Can you stand closer to the microphone, please? You can bend it down so you won't have to stretch.
Thanks.
There you go.
For me to stretch. In 2011, McKenna took over the manufacturer and gained exclusivity rights over a preterm labor drug that went, when available prior to that exclusivity, was at less than $15 per dose. It went up to $1,500 after McKenna took the exclusivity rights. So and actually I know this is not maybe diabetes related, but there is a concept that we have to think about the effect on public health.
Well said, and I don't think anybody in here wants to honor those who took advantage of the system, but at the same time we can't ignore the need to be a good steward of others' monies. When people invest in our companies, it's not our money, it's somebody else's money, and we're obliged to give them back. Just as a grant from the NIH, it's not really the investigator's money. He's a steward of those resources, and he's duty-bound, or she, to do the work that was written in the proposal. That's basically how we operate. That's the contract. I don't want to defend those folks at all. I think.
No, but I think there needs to be some discussion, common ground.
I couldn't agree more. The problem oftentimes in our political system is there's an uber solution. Well, cram all of that down. Let's go to the other side. And those typically don't work out very well, so they have unintended consequences. Panel, thank you very much. This has been very good, and I hope we finished on a high note. Zan?